One of the things, and we're going to dive into Workday, but Workday isn't the only. So we're using it as the representative example, but there's any other system, any other process, anything is going to fall under this rule of standardization. And I'm a big fan of standardization. I like standardizing things, and I think there's a time and a place for it. So, for example, if you have reports and you can standardize a report that everybody gets and you can standardize how it is filtered through and generated and gives the information to people and turns it from data to something useful,
yeah,
great. That's great standardization. But then you have circumstances using that same thing as an example where, let's say you now have a grant that is clinical trial, you now have a grant that is a PPG, you now have a grant that is incredibly complicated and requires much more granular attendance. The standardization won't necessarily help.
Correct.
And I found that in cases with pre-award, when you're submitting like a foundation grant versus submitting an NIH grant versus submitting an NIH PPG or an ARPA-H or a contract, but we live in a world that is almost obsessed with standardization to the point where we're even trying to standardize people. Right?
Yeah.
It's like we're literally trying to make everything fit into this standardization. So I guess to start, let's talk, we're here today to have the conversation about it. So for you, sister, where do you fall in on this standardization conversation?
I feel like I've gone back and forth so many times on this. I think obviously what you said, there are certain things that have to be standardized. If you have root reports that, everyone's using for financial analytics, meaning like coming out of Workday. I think there are certain reports that kind of everybody uses, but I'm talking about raw data. Like that raw material that comes out of the system that is then analyzed. I think obviously there has to be a standard because everyone's reaching for those and then customizing them to their own needs, but the system can't necessarily generate, 1001 versions of the exact same data.
Right,
so
of unique reports.
Yeah, so I think it makes sense for the raw data to come out in a standard form. I think that's kind of like an accepted business practice that's kind of common everywhere, like whether it was your old Oracle reports or CPARs or BIX reports, whatever those reports were, like we're used to seeing like Document Direct. There's definitely always been this underlying understanding that there's going to be those raw data reports that come out in a standard format. So I think that that's kind of accepted industry practice. Then I think forms that everybody uses to execute certain tasks. So cost transfers, labor cost transfers, journal entries, petty cash, patient reimbursements, things like that. I think standardization is really critical because, for taxation purposes, for reporting purposes, for the finance office to be able to easily track and not have to pivot back and forth to figure out who's doing what because the forms are different. I think forms need to be standardized. So for me, I think those two things are kind of critical. And I think those are industry accepted practices that those should be standardized forms. Where it gets a little bit tricky is when we're talking about analytical devices, right? Systems or processes or spreadsheets or tools that are created to support analytics of data. This is where I'm torn. Mm-hmm. I build standardized systems, right? So for me, I've built custom recons that are standard for organizations. So I can see the value there, but I also see a major risk where not everybody's brain processes data the same way when it comes to analytics. And I think that there is a little bit of one danger in forcing people to use a standard tool for analyzing data because everybody thinks differently, and you might actually end up creating a problem, not solving one, because their brains don't process information the same way as, say, their neighbor or their colleague. But then I also think people need to feel some independence and ownership and creativity in their work to be satisfied and to feel that affinity for work, that comes beyond just a paycheck. I think having that independence and creativity and license to be able to have fun with what you're making and doing is important. And I think when we over-standardize things and over-structure things, we kind of lose some of that. So, I don't know. I think I'm torn. Because I see the value in it, but then I also see that, I think it's a risk-benefit analysis that every organization would have to do, kind of knowing their own workforce and the competence of their workforce to make a decision about where to stop standardization and where to allow that creative, free-flowing, human element to come in. So, I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I think, going back to the standardized forms, what's interesting is that I do a lot of work with smaller businesses, compared to say larger academic institutions,
Yeah.
still pretty big companies, they're just smaller. And they typically will use another type of system. They'll use Campfire, they'll use QuickBooks, they'll use something else that they use to manage their financials. And oftentimes they'll have, like, I'll be involved in a variety of different ways, and to generate, they have, QuickBooks has a standard report that regardless of which of my clients it is, I can go to it, find it, and generate
Yeah,
it.
exactly.
So it allows me then to take that and say, okay, I'm going to spit this out and create, whatever I need to be able to for our audit purposes and whatnot. So I think that, like you said, the having the data spit out in literally a table format. Honestly, the truth is the simpler the table, the better.
Yes.
Because then you can take that raw data and parse it through something that creates. Now, going back to what you were saying related to the standardized forms, I think there's a challenge with that. So, one of the challenges is, and going, like, I think the independence thing is also important. So, like, now I agree, we do need to have standardized forms for, like, that makes it useful because I know what form you're going to get, what form someone else is going to get, everybody knows the form, right? It's like the FTP templates. Like, those are super helpful because we all know what we're going to get, right?
Exactly,
It's so frustrating when people are not part of the FTP partnership or don't use the FTP templates. And you're like, why are you not using this tool that just, like, exists out there for you? Aside from, if you have to join it to pay, that's a whole other story. Well,
apparently there's also a wait list.
is there? It's been so long since I've been involved in that side of it, but I did not know. And you know what? I bet you anything you can pay money to go ahead of that wait list.
Probably.
It's all about the money and it's all about the Benjamins. But, like, so, part of it, I think people can become in love with standardization rather than, like, the system. So, for example, the form itself is standardized, let's say. But pull back to the process itself, and maybe the process needs to be examined before the form does. I feel like, there was a phase in my life, which I remember vividly, obsessing with. I loved forms. I loved creating forms. It was right after I learned how to use Adobe. I was learning how to make Adobe PDFs. This was back in, like, the 2000s when nobody was making Adobe PDFs, so I was very cool. Like, I was so cool. And everyone was, oh, Minessa, will you make a PDF for me? Oh, of course I will. And so problem. I loved it because you could fill them out and everything would look so good. Oh, it was just it was great. But, the challenge that ended up happening, which I've actually seen, it's actually so funny because I've, I'm very lucky that, I've had many clients that have come back and forth over the years, right? And you get to see the long-term impacts of standardizing forms. So what ended up happening in one of my clients' organizations was that they added more forms and more forms and more forms. And so by the end, they had like 700 forms. And it was very standardized. Everybody had the standard forms, but there were so many. And there were so many things that people had to fill out over and over again. The question then became, is the issue with the forms? What happened on your end right now? Just now. What turned off?
I muted myself.
Oh, I was like, suddenly you became very quiet. Whatever it is fixed itself. So the question is like, I think that we can rely too heavily on forms and things like, because that's the way we've thought in the past. We've been using forms since 1720, right? Like, we need to start thinking about it in terms of the system. So now the form, so let's use an example of like, REDCap is a really, like a lot of PIs use REDCap for that kind of thing, where basically you're like, all right, let's create a form that then generates into a system that then sends to somebody else, that then sends to somebody else, so that now instead of just having standardization forms, we have standardization systems that actually save time versus the standardization forms, which really create more work, more stuff to review, more chaos, but it falls in alignment with that sort of. And I think going to the third point you made, which is about independence, is I feel like, unpopular opinion here, is that I don't know that our independence needs to come from the independence that comes from creating fancy spreadsheets, right? Like the independence will come from the information that the standardized reports will give you, or the standardized systems give you, that then allow you to exercise the higher level thinking related to research administration, which right now is actually really hard to do, because I think that there are so many people, and this is the number one call I get right now, and it's not even all about Workday, is, can you help us? We've switched from X system to Y system, and we have the problems that we can't get our reports. We can't do these 7 or 8 things. And so now, while we are exercising our independence to build nice reports, the actual compliance stuff isn't happening, right? So, like, isn't that something somebody would want to outsource to in some way? Like, and I don't, again, it needs resources, right? You can't just, somebody can't just decide, hey, like, I'm stuck on that point.
Yeah, and I think that that's really, creativity is a luxury, right? That I think a lot of people at organizations get to enjoy when things are, I don't want to say good, but I'll say more stable than unstable. So when you have, more stability than you have instability, I think there's more room for creativity because people are doing their jobs. They have the basic tools that they need to be successful. When you have no reports, right? I think that actually forces creativity, right? It forces people to really reach into their, creative engines to come up with solutions because the data is not readily available or the systems they used to use are broken or something's not working. So I feel like there is a difference between creativity that's permitted by the organization and fostered by the organization because it's part of a stable work environment and we want people to have effective commitment and feel really connected to their work and have that independence and ownership, versus that forced innovation that comes out of necessity when you don't have what you need. When the organization, for whatever reason, they're going through a change, they're going through, new software deployment. Those are all normal things that happen. You and I have been through how many software developments and launches? It's countless at this point. They're never smooth. It doesn't matter how much you plan. It doesn't matter how well organized you are or how good the software is. Change inevitably comes with a cost. And that cost is not always monetary, right? It's integration. It's the flaws that only show up at scale. You can test something to death in a micro environment, but as soon as you would deploy it into a macro environment, you're going to uncover stuff that maybe is. But I don't know. I still go back to. But again, I also have to preface this by saying, I probably should have gone into engineering. I am a kind of a builder by nature. That's where I'm happiest. So if somebody gives me something and just says, here, this is what you have to use, and it's an Excel, or I'm probably going to still find a way to make it my own, because even if it's something small, like manipulating colors or fonts or anything like that, just because to me, I need to enjoy the space I work in, even digitally. Obviously, you can see I take immense value and professional fulfillment out of having that ownership and having my own spice, involved. I also think that in this industry, research, every investigator is different, and I also think we have to consider, when we do standardization, where is the line between support and not support? Meaning, and let me explain that, meaning if you have a PI, right, obviously the more standard things are, the easier it is for them to navigate because it always looks the same, they know what they're getting. But at the same time, when does that standard become suffocating because their science might be different or their lab's unique needs might be different and they need that extra layer of customization to really have their needs met? What is that tipping point? And how do we navigate that as RAs, where we're kind of that front-facing customer service compliance? We're the first stop, right? So I think a big part of building and cultivating and maintaining and nurturing those relationships with PIs is understanding their unique needs and making sure that whatever tools and resources we have meet those needs. So maybe there's an in-between where it's standard to a point, Maybe that's the sweet spot is you have standards, but you still have the ability for people to add not just creativity for job satisfaction, but creativity for practical reasons because, they have a faculty member who has a very unique portfolio with unique needs. So
I think the way you think about it then is kind of like this, right? So any organization, and we're going to we'll go from almost like a smaller size, so let's say you only have one research administrator and 12 PIs, right? Which I've had some clients, primarily undergrad institutions who are PIs that are like that. But, so those are one story where, it's a small enough bucket that you can figure it out.
Sure, yeah.
But let's talk about something that is a larger, maybe a academic organization with multiple departments, multiple PIs, multiple different accounts, and so on and so forth. So my thought is that, okay, so you're going to have a bucket, almost like there's going to be a segment that's going to be the easy, low-hanging fruit segment that all falls into the standardizable, right? And, and I've had those departments over the years, it doesn't really matter which organization I go in, those departments tend to be fairly straightforward.
Yeah.
And then you have some that are ridiculously oh my God, this is, this one account is 5 million different things and this standardization won't actually work. And typically this may be a conversation as part of a larger solution, right? Because if you're going to say, all right, now we're standardizing humans to where we're standardizing all of the spreadsheets because all of the humans are the same and all of the grants are the same. And so we're trying to force this, right? If we go more meta and say, all right, we're going to pull even further out, and we're going to say, you know what, the portfolios are different. These are the ones that we're going to call standards. They're the ones that are going to get all of the standard stuff, all the standard reconciliation, and those are typically going to be your RAs who they don't want that level of creativity in that space.
Sure,
right?
sure.
Not everybody does, and because like it's interesting, I've known RAs over the years who all get satisfaction from different places, right?
Yes,
100%. Some
100%.
get satisfaction, like you and I get satisfaction from the chaos. Some people get satisfaction from not the chaos, right? So like you're probably not going to be the person who sits and manages a steady portfolio over time that doesn't.
No,
You
give me the
bored.
messy stuff to clean up. You know,
Right,
like,
exactly, and me too. I don't. That's for me. I want the chaos, right? And so, or I want the ones that the PIs are mad and they're upset. But like those are the ones that are they're gonna. One of two things is gonna happen. Either we're gonna filter them out and we're gonna discover it. We're gonna like go put them through our various filters and figure out that they can be standardized once you actually clean up through all the mess that's there and realize, oh, okay, this is actually fairly straightforward. Or those are going to be ones where someone who is in the engineering space or in the like at that level who's been doing grants for a very long time, who understands the complexities of it, is able to say, okay, now this system that I'm building or this spreadsheet or this process or whatever is going to work with this PI who is now almost like you graduate into it, or it's for RAs who like that kind of thing, so that the solution of standardization isn't again one size fits all.
yeah.
You know, like it has to be on the systemic level of the organization, right? Because of, like you said, the reports that, you know, Workday or PeopleSoft spits out, they're not going to change it because the Department of Radiology wants it changed, right? You know, but if we get all those spit out in a standard format and then say, okay, this is the standards, and then these are the ones that are like being considered outside of standards.
You know, and I think you really make a very important point that I always have to remind myself of is that, you know, we see the world through our own bias, right?
Yeah.
And so for me, it's very easy to say, like, you know, well, I kind of feel like, you know, we should be able to make our own spreadsheets and this and that because I am that kind of person, right? So like I see the world through the lens of what satisfies.
Sister, you are very in the minority.
Exactly. So I am definitely in the minority because people, like having a standardized reconciliation tool might actually be the biggest gift you can give to a large subset of RAs because it takes that pressure off of them of having to come up with the system, right? Because sometimes a lot of, like, I mean, I know I struggle with some writing papers or articles is like, you know, I have that blank page syndrome where like it's really difficult for me just to kind of get that first turn of the wheel going. And as someone who has built spreadsheets, you know, it is very iterative, you know, like, I mean, it is a really long process to kind of be like, oh, do I need this? Do I need that? What formulas do I need? So I think that I also have to constantly remind myself that the world is not my point of view. And standardization might be the biggest gift an organization can give to its staff because it empowers them to actually focus on the work as opposed to having to come up with a way to do it. And then, you know, that's a lot to ask. You know, I would say sometimes, especially if you're also doing cleanup and also doing pre-award and doing post-award and doing HR, like we're wearing a lot of hats. I think this is something you and I have talked about in previous videos, is that our job has changed so much. And when I think about what it meant to be a research administrator when I first started in the early 2000s and I compare it to now, it's unrecognizable. I mean, it is so completely different. The demands mentally, emotionally, psychologically, logistically are, I would say, exponentially greater. And I do think, I mean, the burnout, I'd be very interested to know if there's any studies that have been done on kind of the burnout factor in this job, because like I feel like I don't think I've ever met an RA in recent memory who has not said, oh, I'm just so burnt out.
Oh my God, I know, right? So many.
Yeah,
so
and
many.
I think that what you talked about, having standardized forms, having standardized systems, having automated workflows like through systems like RedCap. Once those, like, I think there is a pain process of getting those implemented, but I think once those are live and people are actually feeling well trained and like everybody knows what their part is in the process, I think it does help. It does alleviate some of that unnecessary noise that can just be an additional pressure that honestly no RA right now has bandwidth for. So I think considering that, I do think, you know, when we talked earlier, like I was like, oh, I'm kind of on the fence. Like, I think that it probably solves more problems than it causes.
You know,
So I'm rethinking my position a little
Well,
bit.
actually, so let's touch base on this. You said something about standards. Oh shit, you were talking about dangers of standardization, and you said something that was iterative. I think one of the other dangers, sorry, stretching. One of the other dangers of standardization is that, and I actually this is a direct result of capitalism and all of the horsemen, because like colonialism forces us to be perfect. So like what you do has to be perfect. Okay, so now if we're gonna do a standardization, let's say I come into an organization and I say, okay, they're like, we're hiring you, we want you to standardize our reports. Great, we're gonna do that, right? The expectation is often like people say things like, yes, I understand it's going to be iterative, but inside we are conditioned to want perfection. We're conditioned to want the first run. And so one of the things that I do a lot is say this is we're iterating to the final version, because iteration will always create something better all then when you say this is the perfect thing, I'm going to create it, because the perfect thing, like you said, is created in a vacuum. It can't withstand the pressures that come from actual usage.
Yeah.
And so you have to be able to alpha test, you have to be able to beta test. And we think about alpha and beta testing as, oh, I'm going to alpha test this piece of software, I'm going to beta test this piece of programming. But what you're really doing is you're beta testing against human beings using something. You're beta testing against our behaviors, the things that are going on. And so when we try to standardize, to your point, there's a hair in my mouth I'm trying to get out. Thank God there it is. When we try to standardize, a lot of times we then end up putting that pressure on as well. And so now we've standardized, everybody get this perfect. And now that pressure of perfect, I'm going to actually ask you, because I pulled this, it's funny you asked about the burnout, because I actually pulled this for an article I wrote a while back. There was a study that, because I was like,
there's a hummingbird at my window.
Oh my God, I can't see it, but I believe you.
Oh, I wish I could take a photo.
There was a study they did. It was about 6 years ago, so it's not super, like, not like it's not the most recent in the whole world, right? But it's recent enough to where they found that almost 68.3% of RAs had high personal burnout. Ooh. And then a little bit less than that had a work-related burnout. It was about 2,500 RAs, and it was across...
Wow.
Well, yeah. So, like, over half of them,
yeah,
considered leaving the profession, and
really?
a little bit about half of them said that they reported working more than 45 to 50 hours a week. And so like so like, and I mean that seems to be I know, right? So like, this job, and so here's what's interesting is that about half of them also reported that they were, and this is what I thought was interesting, I remember making a note about it, they neglected themselves. And I think this is where we're not just talking about people burning out, we're talking about people burning out and actively doing harm to themselves without realizing it, right? So like, you're not resting, you're not sleeping, you start taking, drugs to sleep, drugs to wake up, and no judgment. I am a person who takes a lot of medication. But when we're taking it to compensate for the rigors and like to survive capitalism and the lack of boundaries, right? It's like, it's a different story. Yeah. And it creates and it's a whole different thing. And so I think these are like important because, part of standardization is, and I'm going to say this and I feel sick of even saying it, but like, if you say, okay, hey, Saira, we're going to standardize this, right? In my mind, how that sentence finishes, because that way you can do more work and you can be more productive. And I just got to be honest, like that makes me a little nauseous that that's the next step, because really what it should be doing is saying standardization is going to create more freedom for you to do your work and enjoy your work in this time that is allotted for work.
Right.
So that you can maintain boundaries and, do the things that you need to do to not neglect yourself. But I don't know that I've ever said that out loud, that that's the answer. When people are standardizing, it's so you can do more work, so you can be more productive.
Well, I'm going to push back a little bit, because I think you're right. That is what's said, but I think that I think it's a language issue, and I think you make a really good point, because I think what people hear, and I say this as someone who used to be a manager, right? What you're saying you're hearing when those words are spoken is, I'm trying to create more efficiencies for you so I can add to your workload. So you can do
exactly what I hear. Absolutely.
Right? I know from personal experience, and again, I see the world through my own bias, right? We're gonna just say that out loud. And not everybody works like I do. But the managers I've worked with, and I've been very fortunate to work with some excellent ones, I think what it really means, what they're really trying to say, which is, it doesn't come out right, which is why I'm kind of saying, like, kind of going back to what you always say, which is be careful about what you say and how you say it, because people don't necessarily hear unless you're very explicit and deliberate.
They're not hearing what you're
And
saying.
intentional is standardization is going to help you do the work you already have faster.
Yeah.
So that you don't have to spin your wheels on doing a task that takes you 10 hours. Now it's going to take you 3. And now, instead of having to work overtime in order to get the other 20 things done, you're going to be able to get those things done in the workday.
Yeah, exactly.
But that's not what people hear, right? And I think that you make a really important point, that it is so important for managers to really think about that language, because honestly, I never thought about it either. Until you just said those words, I never thought to myself that someone meant, this is going to mean I can give you more work. I always interpreted it as, this is going to allow you to be more efficient so you can get all the things done that you need to get done without having to work more. But that's also because I have managed people. And so I think my brain wiring maybe just is a little different than yours.
Nope. I also think it's a secondary thing too, that you're not touching upon the work that you've done for decolonization and clearing up your relationship with work and time. Because like, you are describing a unique perspective that does not exist in most of the managers in this world. And I have spoken with so many managers, and what they say is, and I've seen managers like you and managers like me, and like, so I hear this as an employee. So like when somebody says that to me, I hear that. As a manager, that's not what I say, right? So like, I'm very careful to say that. But in a capitalist world where somebody is constantly designed to like quotas, grants, we're understaffed, so on and so forth. If I can make you more effective, I can give you more stuff, then you can do more work and you can produce and have more value for me. And the reason why I know this is because I've had managers come to me and say to me, I cannot believe X person is so lazy. I cannot believe this. And I happen to know that person's not lazy. That person is neurodivergent and needs a different type of guidance. That person. And so in a world that is governed by the 4 horsemen, the workers are always the ones who are going to be at fault. And we need to be able to extract as much work out of them as possible because it's built off of chattel slavery, right? So that's the challenge, is that you've done a lot of work and a lot of managers have done a lot of the work, and we're seeing the ship turn. But I have to be honest, that ship is very slow in turning. And so what you have is a lot of dissatisfied people and 2 very different experiences of research administration.
Yeah, no, and I think it's a really important point for any managers watching to really understand what you mean when you say those things. And if you mean, if you actually mean this means you can do more work, well, that's right. I mean, that's fine. But say that. But if what you're really trying to say to people is like, I'm trying to create greater efficiencies for you through standardization to balance your workload so that you're not having to work overtime to achieve the things that you need to achieve.
Yeah.
That's a really different message. And I think that there's no harm in being very direct about that, because I think it's true. Like, I remember that music video by, God, who was it? Was it New Order? Elegia?
That was so good. That was Elegia.
But it really makes you, because it's all about, like, it's just this constant push to be productive, right? This constant machine. And, we're like, honestly, it is kind of like we're a machine, like as a collective, as a group, as an organization, whatever, we kind of function together. Everybody has their own circuits and their own jobs, right? Everybody's doing something to kind of serve the greater purpose of whatever that machine is. And I think especially in healthcare, the engine never sleeps. Healthcare is not 9 to 5. Healthcare as a business, as an organization, as a social need is 24/7, 365. There are no off days. When you think about COVID-19 and you think about pandemics or you think about emergencies, right? Healthcare doesn't get the day off, right? If there's a lockdown, healthcare is open, right? It's one of the things that is open for business.
Right.
I mean, I think the only thing that would probably prevent it would be like if there was truly Walking Dead zombie apocalypse, maybe then, right? But otherwise, so I think there's also this inherent veil over the industry of healthcare in general that it is a 24/7, 365 machine. And that the risks are so high in what we do. And of course, research administrators aren't working in patient care, right? It's not like we're seeing patients or, doing things in the ER or anything like that. But the people we work with are, the physicians we work with are, the nurses, the study coordinators, the staff, like a lot of those people that are seeing those really sick patients in trials, there is an element, an aura of this 24/7, 365 machine, I think, all throughout healthcare. And I do think that puts us at a unique in a unique position where when we say things like, oh, well, our people need balance, right? Or we need to have 40 hours of work a week. That's not unreasonable, right? That is perfectly reasonable. But I think because of the environment that we're in, sometimes that can seem out of place. So the RAs feel this guilt, right? When they're not working 50, 60 hours, when they're not. So it's complicated. Like, I think it's a really complicated psychology, and it's a really odd ecosystem that we're in. And I think that does not help people with the burnout and setting those boundaries and really being, like you said, mindful about self-care and intentional about it. And I do think a lot of organizations that, even you and I have worked in have done a really good job of reminding people. Like, they have entire offices and email chains that go out talking about self-care and talking about how to take care of yourself, and offering yoga or employee assistance programs. Like, I do think we're in a time where organizations really do feel that those are priorities and that they want to empower and support their staff in feeling work-life balance. But I also think that some of it just comes down to the nature of our work. It's so complex and so demanding. Sometimes I even wonder if more staff would even solve it.
I think it could solve it if you had more staff, more money, right? So, like, it all depends on what your priorities are. So if I say right now that my priority are as research administrators and making sure that this engine runs smoothly, right, then it's going to take money. We live in a capitalist world. It's going to take money, which means in order for me to do that, I'm going to have to invest X million dollars, right? Any organization that's going to do that then has to take that X million dollars from somewhere else, right? Where is that going to be coming from? And so it's an uncomfortable truth, but what you're really saying is that is not a priority for me. This is more of a priority, right? And it's, I'm doing a lot of my yoga studies right now, and the Satya is about truth and non-harm, right? So, like, it's not about judgment. It's not about saying, hey, you suck because you're doing this, but it's about recognizing the truth of what is actually happening so that we can assess how to make changes, right? So if I say the staff is important to me and how they feel is important to me, but all of my actions,
right?
I do a whole lot of actions to help the staff, but I don't do any actions to alleviate the amount of work that's on their plate,
Which is the root of the issue, right?
Then I'm not actually solving problems, and that's not actually a priority for me. It's more priority for me to do performative actions that make it look like I'm doing this rather than doing the actual activity. And so the standardization in that point is the standardization of social pressures that now what happens, and I've seen this happen in a lot of organizations where, so I work 50 hours a week and you work 40 hours a week because you clock out, right? And you and I are talking and you tell me, I'm like, oh, I worked late this weekend, whatever. And you're like, oh, I clock out. Yeah. And I'm mad. I'm like, wow, that must be nice, right? Because I'm working. So why am I working? And I'm mad, right? I get paid the same amount as you. And so now I'm going to say something to you because we're friends or sisters or whatever.
Yeah.
You're going to now feel guilty about it. And you're going to be like, well, maybe I'm not working enough. And the capitalist stories and all those start coming in. So now you start working. So it's a self-regulating system of standardization that exists because if you don't set the standards, then the standards will be set for you. Right? So, like, I think organizations, have to be more honest about what their priorities really are. And it's okay to say that, look, you know what? We only have X million dollars. I can't put it towards this. We're not giving you raises. We're not doing that. But that means that burnout's going to happen. And then what really needs to be happening after that is the RAs at that point setting boundaries. And that's where I think we struggle, right? Because people don't change until the lack of changes cost them enough. And so if every RA everywhere starts working the hours that they're supposed to work, but maybe give or take a little bit, eventually the change will have to happen because the consequences will be too high.
It's funny in economics, this is actually very common, is that the system, it's so amazing that the system actually it self-corrects itself, right? Exactly what you're describing. That a lot of this stuff just happens inherently because of design, right? There's really no way around it. The human element eventually is going to either burn out, just like economies, right? If you overinflate a stock or, eventually it self-corrects. There is no hiding from the truth. It eventually comes out one way or another. But I think going back to standards, I think you actually bring up a really good point too, is that we spent a lot of time today talking about, the standard, like the standards that we take for granted, which is like forms and templates and Excel documents and systems. But standards are also expectations. Standards are also how we expect people to show up and what they feel is expected of them in the workplace. It's what are the standards of being an employee of an organization? So I think standardization goes beyond just the obvious, which is just the paperwork. There's also the process, the systems, how we expect people to interact with one another, even down to the granular level of what the job really is. And I think that's probably the standard that organizations can do the most with and have the biggest impact is standardizing the expectations of the job. Because once you really implement standards and publish those standards and communicate and train against those standards, I don't think it ever becomes a situation of, well, I'm sorry, I can't help you with that. It's not my job. It becomes a matter of there is someone more qualified to help you with that because it is their job, right? And I am not an HR expert. I don't know every loophole related to, visas and immigration and H-1B versus J-1s versus self-funded and sponsored and job change. Like, that's a lot of information. I can't be an expert in everything. So for me to tell an investigator or their designee, like, oh, you really need to talk to somebody in this department, I can't really help you with that. It's actually not me saying, oh, that's not my job, right? Like, it's truly me redirecting you to the resource that's best suited to solve your specific problem. It's just like if you go into the emergency room, like we had this with mom. When we went into the emergency room and mom was really sick, they did what they could for her, but they also recognized that what she needed was an expert in gastroenterology, right? And they were emergency room trained physicians. They were not going to be able to diagnose or treat her advanced cancer. She needed to go in and see an expert who was specifically trained to handle her specific disease profile. So I think like that's something where I think standards can be really powerful and helpful to people because it gives clarity. And I think it empowers people to do better work and for work to flow where it's best served, as opposed to what we've been doing, I think, for a really long time is doing everything. Because as RAs, that's how it used to be. We used to be everything. And now we can't be because there's just too much volume. So I would actually think, when we're thinking about standards, I think standardizing the job is probably where there's the most power and impact. You have no sound again.
You're right. I don't have any sound. I think also, so Jacqueline Pittman wrote, she said, thanks for talking about language when it comes to how standardization benefits research admin teams. Because this is resonating, right? I think I lost, you said something and I was going to answer you and then I was muted and then I lost, what was that last thought? What was the last thread that you said you were talking about?
Oh, that standardizing the expectations of the job is probably the most impactful and powerful thing. That's the last thing I said.
Yeah, it was right before that where you were talking about
sending the work to the place where
okay, sending the work. Yes. Okay. So it goes back to like how so for me, and a lot of this is work we have to do on ourselves. So I have my podcast on YouTube. I, by the way, also tried to put the link for Allegia in here because it's just a really good video.
So good. But it's so heartbreaking.
Good. But, because a lot of these things we have to do, like the work we have to do on ourselves. And I'll be honest, it made me super angry to realize there was work I had to do on myself. I was like, why can't everybody else just fix the problem? But apparently it turns out we got to work on ourselves too. And part of those things end up becoming like, so I'm a people pleaser. Wouldn't say I am anymore. But I was a desperate people pleaser. I was so afraid because if we're going to be brutally honest about what people pleasing is, I was so afraid of rejection. That I was willing to literally bend myself over into a pretzel and manipulate myself into doing.
Yes.
Now I was totally, what's super interesting and almost antithetical to like the people pleasing side is I was also very, very, if I knew where I was in compliance or money or any of those things, I had no problem just standing my ground and saying, this is how it is, right? But anything that required like a gray area or something like that, like, or where I had to like, where I felt like I was like a, what's the word, going to be rejected, I struggled. And my boss had to, Jen Sabag, she worked with me for a long time on how to navigate that space because as an RA, we can't really be people pleasers. We have to do our jobs. That was great. It ended up manifesting in my personal life then, right? So like if you don't sort your actual problem out, it's just going to go somewhere else to show up, right? So the challenge, I think, for us now is in people pleasing is that, okay, so compliance stuff's great, but I'm always going to try to help you if you ask me for help, which was possible at one point when we only had so many things to do. But now that we have so much to do, if I help every person who asks me for help, then several things happen. One, everybody gets the wrong idea of who's supposed to do what, which means that, let's say I get hit by a bus, God forbid, or I move or go somewhere else or whatever, and as a consultant, I am necessarily transient. Then what ends up happening then is that they don't know who to go to. And now I've created a worse situation for them down the line. Whereas instead of saying, okay, so now the standardized process is I'm going to direct you to HR for this. Even if I know the answer, I will direct you to HR because I want to empower you with knowledge so that you always know where to go. And then you can tell your staff and so on and so forth. And so, but because many of us are worried about not being needed, because if we aren't needed, then we lose our jobs and then we're going to be homeless. We will do everything that is asked of us rather than setting boundaries or redirecting. And that's an us thing, right? That was a me thing. I had to work that shit out on my own and create the safety within myself to say that this isn't my job. So even though or my boss had to, right? At certain stages in my career, my boss said, listen, stop doing this. You are making life miserable for everybody else by doing this, because now everybody else is getting questions to do the thing that is not our job. And I was many, many years ago. And if my goal is to make people's lives easier, how does that action make everybody's life easier, as opposed to making just my life better and one other person's life easier because I helped them in that one moment? And so I think you're right. Standardization is the job itself needs to be standardized, which I think Chris Monahan is working on with the Department of Labor. So that's going to be I think that's a really exciting change to come, because that gives us other options.
Yeah. Yeah. All right.
All right. As we start to wrap up now, sister, any final thoughts?
I guess my final thought would really just be this. Standardization can be a powerful tool in your tool belt to help your staff and your organization meet the needs of their staff and their jobs better. But I think it's important to always look at standardization from the lens of how is it going to help support people feel more empowered, more informed, more supported. It should be a solution, and the standard, whatever standardization is happening, involve people in the conversation, right? The stakeholders are the people who are the end users, right? The person who's who's the last stop, right? The RA using the form, the research finance person using the form, or the RA doing the job. I think it's really important that whenever you implement standards, that people have a voice so that their needs are met, and that you're not creating a standard that's going to leave out half of your population. So it's important to be inclusive. I think standards have a real important place in any organization, but I think ensuring that people are involved in that process is going to be key. And also the recognition that standards only really support 90%, right? You're always going to have those outlier situations where whatever standard you come up with may not apply. And so I think it's important for standards to not be rigid. Standards are more, I would say, 90% of the time, yes, but I think you have to also leave room for some flexibility, because it's never going to be one size fits all in this industry. So that's my
Ain't that the truth? Thoughts. So I think that what I would leave is two things. One is leverage your resources. Saira and I are a resource. So if you're, and this is our jam. So if you want to just get on a call, and we love to geek out about these kinds of things. So
totally.
I can't even tell you how many times somebody's been from NCR or somebody, when an organization has been listen, we've run into this problem. Can we sit and just talk? Saira and I'll get on a call. We'll talk and just kind of brainstorm with them, kind of working through the solution, which is really fun for us. It's actually really fun. So it gives us the opportunity to see a lot of different problems that people run into and how people solve them. So that's if you got a problem, I'll solve it. Now I'm vanilla ice. And then the second thing is iteration. I think if there is anything that I could possibly say to anyone, it is do not strive for perfection. Strive to iterate. Don't wait. Just launch. Stop preparing. Why are we always preparing? Just go. You're going to find if you let's say you do let's say right now. You launch anything, just literally anything as a standardization. You will, even going halfway, if that gets you just halfway there, your journey is this long, but you're only going halfway there, that is still farther than you would have been otherwise if you just waited. And then when you iterate again, you'll probably get halfway, which will get you closer and closer and closer. You will never hit perfection, but you will hit close enough to where it doesn't matter. It's substantively the same thing. So get a divorce from perfection.
Yes.
It is not your friend. That is my gift. My gift to you all is that. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Saira, we're not here next week, right? Are we here next week?
No, I think we're doing every other week, and I am actually on vacation, and so I think we're coming back again in a month.
In a month. Okay, so Saira's on vacation, so we'll be back in a month from now. Have a wonderful rest of your summer, and we'll see you in August.
All right.
Bye, sister.
Bye.